Mary's attitude towards wine, as I mentioned to you before, is that wine was never an end in itself. It was always a means to an end. And the end that it was a means to was conviviality. You drink it with family, you drink it with friends, and it's a life-enhancing experience. And that's what it is, and that's what it does. It enhances civilization. And so whenever I look and I'm dealing with the vines, I just think of her. And I think of that attitude towards what it is that we're doing.
Welcome to the Bountifull Podcast, where we explore what it means to live a bountiful life. Today we embark on an exciting journey into the world of winemaking. I'm delighted to be here in the studio with the super talented and philosophical David Hoskins, a true pioneer in the New Zealand wine industry and the mastermind behind Herons Flight Vineyard. David, welcome to the Bountifull Podcast.
Thank you very much.
It's a privilege to be with you here today and to have this time in the picturesque setting of Matakana, New Zealand, where Herons Flight Vineyard sits atop a north-facing slope, basking in the beauty of the Matakana coast.
Yes, and it's quite a good day today, so you're in luck.
So tell me how you see the world. A philosophical question. It's perfect for you.
I was born in the U.S., and I grew up, went to school in the U.S., but I've lived in New Zealand most of my life. But I still have friends. I still have my best friend at high school. Still communicate, and at my first university, still communicate. And as I mentioned to you last night, this one particular person was, sent me his annual Christmas card with photographs and things, and was so depressed by the state of the world that he couldn't do it. So I think we're very fortunate to be living in New Zealand, but in terms of the state of the world, if you're speaking about politics, all we try to do is do what we can and to do whatever good we can in the world.
Yeah. So you were, I'm going to say this, I don't know if it's true, but probably one of the first Americans in New Zealand to set up shop here.
No, there were a couple other Americans. So we discovered who had, I think one was in West Auckland, but then they went down country. But I don't know, because I never had much to do with other Americans. I mean, when I first came here, there were very few. Young Americans traveling around. So that could be. But of course, I'm always surprised by people asking me when they meet me, and if they're not familiar, if I've never met them before, where I come from. Because of course I've been here for so long, I always assume I come from here. And so if people ask me where I come from, I say, well, I came from Auckland, where I lived for 15 years before I came here.
Yeah. So what does it mean to you to live a bountiful life?
These are very ambitious questions, aren't they? Very open-ended questions. A bountiful life. That's like a trick question. A bountiful life could mean, as you were saying, in terms of living off the land, trying to get what you can with low, if you're concerned about climate change and food miles and all of that, by saying you want to get whatever you can as close as you can to where you live. I mean, I am in the very fortunate position that I have 3 generations. We have 3 generations living in the same house. Yeah. And that's great for everybody. No, I'm not saying it's perfect, and it's not great necessarily 100% of the time, because we all need our own space, but the building that we live in provides that, I think. And, for me to have the opportunity to interact with my grandchildren is, very special. That you're interacting with them in quite a different way than most grandparents who the grandkids will come over and visit them, or their children will come over. Well, I have all my children living on this property. Everybody lives on the property. Yeah. And this was the vision that my wife and I had. Not quite in the same way. We thought it might be intergenerational in the sense that they would take over from me. I should be long retired by now. Yeah. I mean, a bountiful, what can you say beyond your own localized sphere of influence in terms of your family and then the people in the community? My wife was very involved in the local community. She was a very significant person. She always saw herself as not Mrs. Herons Flight, and she was involved in many different activities. And when she passed away last year, we had a family meeting and said, well, we needed to keep to keep those connections going as far as possible.
What advice would you give your 25-year-old self?
Let me answer that by telling you of some advice I gave a 65-year-old just a year ago. So we opened this new tasting room formally at Labor Weekend a year ago. We had this couple come in, and they to the opening, and they said they were saying, well, they in our house where we used to have a cafe when there was no hospitality in Matakana, and so we lived in the house. I mean, look, our kids used to say, how come they got to use the public toilet? Because it was very unique living situation. However, this woman said, yeah, she used to come to the cafe that we had behind the house, and which we did for about 12 years. And she said they loved coming to it. It was very personal. We had all of our things around, paintings, books, and all of that. And then what we did is we had made a little subdivision and then built a function-specific building. She said, she came to that, but no, that wasn't us. So she never went. Now with this new tasting room, she said, yeah, no, this is more like it. This is more like you in terms of your personality. And she said, they have some land in the area. They've got like a couple acres of grapes. And, they've always wanted to grow grapes. So I said, and she said, do you think we should? And I said to her, okay, I'll give you 2 bits of advice. Now, when we first started, in the mid-1980s, when this is something that we decided we wanted to do, we got to know the Corbin family, and we got to know Joe Corbin and Alex Corbin. And Joe Corbin was the person who supplied grapes to everybody in the country. And but we also asked him, we said, okay, if we want to have a vineyard and we want to make a living out of it, how much land do we need? And they said, well, if you want to grow grapes as a contract grower, then you need a minimum of 25 acres. Yeah. That's to make a living. However, if you want to add value and make the wine yourself, then you need a minimum of 10 to 12 acres. Mm. So, but he said, I wouldn't do it if I were you. Too hard, don't do it. And he was, he would say, don't do it. Because what he was doing, he was always challenging. All of these people would come in and say, oh, maybe this is what they want to do. And he would challenge them, and he would tell them all the problems that you would have. But if you work through the challenges, which is what we did, then, we continue to do it. So, now, go back to the 65-year-old. I said, right, now, you got 2 acres. You want to grow some grapes. Now, the advice that was given to me when we started was that, too small. You need more land than that if you want to do it, as a business. And over the years, the advice that I would always give to people is that you want to do it for a whole variety of reasons. You have 1 acre or 2 acres. You're going to spend as much time looking after those grapes and dealing with diseases and the weather as somebody who has 3 or 4 times that. So I said, my advice to you is don't do it. But that's one half of me. And the other half, and the advice that I would give to me as a 25-year-old, that I would give anybody, I would say, never have any regrets. Do it, because you don't want to move on and wish you had. Yeah. And the beauty of New Zealand and why I've always stayed in New Zealand, why I love New Zealand, is because it's always been a land of what I call opportunity for me. I mean, one of the things, I started a secondary school, which I did in the 1970s, and I went for 25 years. State school as an alternative school, but I was very interested. And I had, as an unknown, very young guy, had just written to the Ministry of Education and said, look, I think that schooling, that you need to be more expansive in what schooling means. And I wrote a whole proposal, whole infrastructural thing. And I got a reply. And he said, I think these are good ideas, and put me in touch with various people. And then, 2 years later, they started it. It was because we've always thought, my wife and I always thought, if you want to try something, you don't have to be wealthy. Just try it. So my advice to myself is the same that I would have had then.
Like go in eyes wide open.
Yeah.
try it, but have...
Yeah, and if you fail, that's okay too.
Yeah.
I mean, not everybody, and certainly not ourselves, have succeeded at everything. I mean, look, I'm coming into my 34th vintage. Not every vintage has been a winner. Yeah. Not every bottle of wine is a winner. I look back and I think, oh, geez, And so, but you try these things, and you try to avoid having any regrets.
So you have a rich history in winemaking at Herons Flight Vineyard. Can you share with us the story of how it came to be and what inspired you to focus on Italian varietals in particular? When in the mid-'80s, because we had always gone out to West Auckland, where all the wineries were, and we used to go out on weekends in the late 70s and the early 80s, and you'd visit wineries, and you'd often, they were primarily Croatian, and they were often intergenerational. We'd go out there and we would visit them and, buy wine and see often the operations. They didn't at that time have any really big flash places. But you got to see what the activity of winemaking was, and grape growing, and then if you wanted something to eat, then there's a picnic table, there's some cheese, there's some bread to help yourself. And we loved that, and we loved that activity. So even though my wife and I were doing different things in the mid-'80s, we said, we'd like to give this a go. We like the idea of doing this, and as I said, alluded to, we thought perhaps it'd be intergenerational because we had young kids. So we said, okay, how do you do it? Yeah.
How do you do that? So we had met some, as I said, we had gotten to know the Corbin family. So we said, okay, given his advice about the size of it, we needed at least a 20-acre block, which would provide 10, 12, 13 acres in grapes. So we decided that, and we always wanted to be open. We always wanted to have a cellar door. Mm. So like the ones that we visited. So we just put a compass in the Auckland CBD and made like an hour's drive. Where could we go? Yeah. Waiheke was just starting out. There were two very young wineries, Goldwaters and Stony Ridge.
Yeah.
And we would go over there on a very slow boat, take 45 hours or something, long, and it was an island.
Yeah.
And there had been a guy in the 1970s who had gone up past Mangawhai north to, there are a whole lot of little lakes on the coast, and he had planted grapes. And he'd planted about 10 acres of grapes, but he'd become very ill and he had to sell it. And so just at this time, his little vineyard was on the market. So we said, well, we don't know where this place is. And we drove up, and it was like 2 hours north of Auckland, so it was too far away. But it was on one of these little lakes called Spectacle Lake. And he had a most amazing vineyard on a little hill, and you looked out over the forestry block and then out to sea. And then we came the back way through Matakana, which we weren't familiar with, and then we discovered this area. Yeah. And Matakana was a little farming village. And then we decided that this is where we would be. It was within an hour's drive. So we spent 18 months looking for an appropriate bit of land. And we just went to every real estate agent and said, this is what we want. Whenever you come across something which you might think is possible, give us a ring and we'll come up and have a look. And then eventually this was a big farm, one of the very first farms being subdivided, and we bought a bit of land.
Awesome.
And that's how we came to be here.
And then tell me about I know that you had some French grapes here at some point, but then you ripped them out and put in Italian. So where did
Yeah. So we grew what we knew. We grew French grapes. We planted Bordeaux varieties, Cabernet, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, and then we grew Chardonnay. That was the plan. We made our first wine in 1991. Alex Corbin came up. He was like a mentor to me, and he and his wife would stay. We'd put them up in a motel, and they'd stay here for the week of vintage. Yeah. And he would say, "Oh, yeah, you do this, you do that, you do that." So the very first wine in 1991, God's smiled. We didn't really know what we were doing. Joe Corbin came up and helped us pick the grapes. So we had both of these amazing brothers. We, picked the grapes, made the wine, and it turned out to be pretty good. But we soon discovered that particularly Cabernet Sauvignon has difficulty getting physiologically ripe. 91 wine was great. 92 was cold and wet. And so I had herbaceous characters, and I said, if we're running a small wine business, you really have to have something which every year which people can drink. It may not be the greatest wine in the world, but something which people like, and unripe Cabernet is not that. So the way we came across Italian grapes is that we were, with our very first wine, we had won one of the top gold medals at the Indonesian wine competition. Only time we ever entered wine competitions. So we got a lot of PR. So anyway, we're doing a tasting down in Wellington. We were driving down, and at that time, the best wine shop, one of the best wine shops in the country was in Taupo, which was Scenic Cellars, and was run by a guy called Peter Taylor. And I didn't know him, but at that particular time, we got into a conversation with him, and he said, I read about your wine, your Cabernet, and I'd like to try it. Do you have any in your car? And I said, well, as a matter of fact, the car's full of it because we're going down to Wellington. He said, let me swap you a bottle of something that you probably have never tasted. And it was a bottle of Italian wine, all in Italian. I have no idea what it was. I never kept it. But when we got home, we opened it within a fortnight, and it was an epiphany. It completely changed the way I looked at winemaking and what wine could be. I said, this is what I want to do. So we were able to get 2 clones of Sangiovese from the University of Bologna and planted them. And throughout the mid-90s, still persevering with Cabernet and the others. And some of the years I wouldn't make Cabernet because it just didn't get ripe enough. Yeah. But one clone of Sangiovese performed pretty well, and even through marginal years. And so in about 1997, 98, we decided to replant the entire vineyard. So we decided that we wouldn't do it all in Sangiovese. We did 2/3 of it. We have about 4.5 hectares of grapes. Yeah. So 3 of them are in this one clone of Sangiovese, but nobody else has this fine stock. So I have a nursery. I have to do all the propagation. Right. So it wasn't like I could go to a nursery and say I'd like 10,000 vines and plant them. It was something that took like 2 or 3 years to move from one to the other. And so, but I thought what I want is another Italian grape that ripens earlier. Yeah. And so we were able to get Dolcetto, which came in a roundabout way from a particular vineyard in Piemonte, and through UC Davis, and then to a small vineyard in West Auckland. Yeah. And we got the fruit from there, and got the grapevines from there. And so that's why we did it, all based on stopping in a wine shop on the way to Wellington.
It's serendipitous, isn't it?
I mean, who would ever have known?
Yeah.
You know, maybe we wouldn't be in business. We were still trying to make Cabernets. I don't know.
What was it about the Italian wine that gave you the epiphany?
It doesn't have herbaceous characters, and it has flavors which French grapes don't have. Even in a marginal year, you can make something which is pretty good. Yeah. And that's my skill level. I'll either be successful at doing that or not, but the fruit will give me the opportunity to do it. So we wanted to make as much as we could on our site because we knew that we'd have to spend a lot of time marketing and getting people to understand what it is that they are. So I mean, people come in all the time and say, "Oh, is this like Tuscany? Is this like Italy or something?" And I say, "Well, if I was going Chardonnay, you don't ask me if it's like Burgundy, because it's so common. It's just uncommon."
And where is your clientele that drinks your wines? Do you have like a loyalist following, or is your wine in like restaurants or supermarkets? Where who's buying your wine?
Now you see, that's interesting. I'm happy to sell the wine to anybody. Yeah, I'm not discriminatory at all. Yeah. But wine shops, retail, very, very difficult because as I was saying in terms of Scenic Cellars, things are very organized. Yeah. So you have a bottle of Sangiovese or a bottle of Dolcetto. Where do you put it? Where do you put it on the shelf? There's no place. Yeah. So retail places find it really difficult. We have a strong online premise. I have a database of just under 2,000 people, but we sell it into a lot of restaurants. We sell it you're from Cromwell. I've started selling into Cromwell. We're selling into Queenstown, selling into Aerotown, selling into a really good wine bar in Wellington, sell it into some very good restaurants in Auckland. And for us, it's really important. For us, I can never judge what I do. I don't know whether it's any good or not. The only way I can judge it if it's out in the public domain. And then a restaurant will have it and somebody drinks it and says, it's not too bad.
Do you think we're seeing or will see a little bit of a sea change in New Zealand where New Zealanders, or like we might start to see a little bit more sophistication in what we're drinking, or a willingness to go outside of the boundaries of like normal traditional wines that we drink from, the places that produce that variety in New Zealand the best? You know what I mean?
What do you think?
No.
No? See, I would say no. No.
I'm hopeful because I really enjoy, varieties that are unusual from a New Zealand context. Like the other day I had an Albarino in Wellington, and one of my friends was like, I've never heard of this before. Like, it's amazing. I'm like, well, yeah, because it's not really done in New Zealand.
The difficulty is that whether you're a small or a mid-size or a big winery, you have to sell what you make. Yeah. And it's much easier to sell your wine if people are familiar with the grape varieties. So if you're dealing with a grape variety which is unfamiliar, then you have to have outlets, restaurants that would have to hand sell it. Yeah. Do I think it's going to change? So about 15 years ago, we had a visit from a guy called Fred Pizzini. Now, Fred Pizzini is a big winery in Australia, obviously Italian generation. This guy, I think, was like the third generation. He was retiring, and he and his wife were on holiday, and they were passing the whole operation over to their children who were taking it over. And he came up, as we would get visits in the 90s and the 2000s, visits from a lot of Italian winemakers. So my winemaking has changed, actually, because of visits that we have from people who would actually deal with these grapes. Yeah. So anyway, this guy came in and he tasted the wines and he said, "Oh, look, he said, these are pretty good." He said, "You're going to have a problem making enough because of the demand you're going to have for this." I said, "Well, I would like that to be the case, but it's not." And I said, he said, because he himself, he does, Shiraz and things, but he specializes in Sangiovese. And he said, he's got really expensive ones, and makes different level. And he sells in the restaurant. He can't keep up with the demand for these things. And I said, look, the difference between what you guys do in Australia and what has happened in New Zealand is that who were the immigrants to Australia? They were, particularly between the wars, they were
Greek and Italian.
All the Greeks, the Italians, the Spanish, all the producers. And the producers brought that culture out with them. May not have brought their particular grape varieties, but at least their knowledge of them. And so I have friends who are Australians, and they come over every 3 months, and they always bring me bottles of Australian wine made with an Italian variety somewhere that, they always search these things out. Could be Fiano, it could be Sangiovese. And they, they do that because, to educate myself and for interest. And I said, so who did New Zealand get? New Zealand got the English, who are the consumers. Yeah. And that's a completely different culture. So, okay, you got the Croatians, and thank goodness for them in terms of the wine grind, except for the Corbins who are Lebanese. But I think we have those two cultural differences. So we'll get visits from young Australians who will have some Mediterranean heritage, and they'll say, their grandfather still buys grapes once a year, makes a wine in his garage and things like that. Because they do that. They make stuff. Yeah. And I don't know that it'll ever change. That was 15 years ago. I can't see any change.
I do actually think that we drink a bit of Fiano at home. I don't know, we just really like wine, and we're willing to give anything a try, which is half of it, right? I do think we're starting to see more international varieties come on.
I'm just looking at it from the number of people who come in who are absolutely have no knowledge of what these things are.
I think I tried to read about all the different Italian varieties once, and I was like, there's too many. I can't.
See, other people, people ask me what I would do if I retired, and I said, well, what I would do, I said, if I won lotto, if I had a bag of money, what I would want to do is I'd want to go to Greece, and I'd want to write a book about indigenous Greek varieties and all these little valleys where they've done it for hundreds and hundreds of years. You cannot pronounce the names of the grapes, but that to me would be something I'd love to do.
And half of them grow on the ground, which is novel.
Yes, that's what. Well, they used to.
Yeah.
I've got photographs of like the 1880s, 1870s within and up north, and that's how they grew grapes. The original people who brought grapevines over, they grew them on the ground.
So can you describe the philosophy behind Herons Flight Vineyard, particularly in terms of nurturing family, community, and a love for slow food, and how this philosophy influences your winemaking? Well,
I've sort of answered that, because saying that, what is a bountiful life mean? Well, a bountiful life means that if you're fortunate enough to be able to be in the arms of your family and all of that, it's very lucky. Now, not all families can do that. Not all families get on. I mean, so I find that at the moment anyway, I think we're very fortunate to be able to do that.
Can you tell me a bit about your winemaking style and the unique techniques that you employ, such as the use of amphoras and extended skin contact?
Yep. So as I said, I always believe that there are far more people who know more than me. And so I'm always interested in talking to other people about what it is that they do. In about 2012, we had a visit from a guy called Danny Schuster. Now, Danny Schuster, I knew who Danny Schuster was, but I never met him. And he was coming up visiting the market with some friends. And it was at a time, I think, that we actually had a stall because we used to make grape juice. And we were down at the market. He came by and he spoke to Mary, and it was in about February or March when the grapes are getting ripe. And he said, oh, look, and he went out and looked at the vineyard, and he said, I think that you've got, even though all the grapes are purple and they all look good, he said, I think that you've got uneven ripening. And he said, I can help you with that. And here's my telephone number. Tell David to get in touch with me if he's interested. So the fact that Danny Schuster wrote the first textbook on grape growing and winemaking in New Zealand. He had his own vineyard in Waipara. Yeah. He started that. And he is an internationally recognized guy on viticulture and winemaking. So I thought, wow, the fact that he came and expressed any interest, so I got in touch with him. And then for the next 10 years until COVID, he just became a friend. And he would come up 3 or 4 times a year, and he'd spend a week. And he would stay with us, and then he'd work. But he changed the way that I looked at extended skin contact. So we keep the skins on during the fermentations for about a month. We don't do any hand plunging. I don't do any pump overs. We do things which is highly unusual. And he said it's all to do with the tannins. And so my whole winemaking is focused on the tannin structure to try to get the tannin molecules to what's called polymerize, which takes time. So he is an incredible guy. People love him or hate him. He's very polarizing because he's very strongly opinionated about things, politics in particular. But he smokes like a chimney, and so he would stay with us, and we had this smoking chair out the back, and he would light a cigarette. He said, "But I'm only smoking organic cigarettes. They're all good for me." I say, yeah. But there's your chair, Danny. And then, he would say, it's 5 o'clock, it's wine o'clock. What are we drinking tonight? But he would go over and he would spend time in Napa, and he was a consultant for Stag's Leap. And so he would go over there and he'd help look after their vineyards, one particular vineyard, and then in terms of the winemaking. And so he introduced me to different techniques, which I still use. Then in 2014, we always employ a couple people besides ourselves, and we had this opportunity to employ an Italian winemaker. there was this New Zealand's leading opera singer called Annalise, and she had been over in Europe for about 10 years doing concerts. And she had given this concert at this one winery, this very old Italian winery in Tuscany. And the winemaker there, head winemaker, loved opera and loved her. And they got together and they had a relationship and fell in love. Then they decided after a couple of years that she wanted to come back and have a family. So she, by this time, was in her late 30s. He was in his mid to late 40s. So they came back and he had to get a job. So we were very small for what he was, but because we were growing these grapes and we got on very well, he said, he'd work here. And they lived in Warkworth. They needed to have some place, because she was still giving concerts overseas. They needed to be close to an airport, Auckland Airport. So he said, this was 2014, he said, no, in his own winery, he had half a dozen amphorae. He loved working with clay. And he said that, and he knew who Danny Schuster was because of his fame in Italy. Yeah. So he said, look, I think that what we need to do is we need to bring one back for you. So I will go to the factory that makes these and I'll get one made, but there are a few tricks. You don't want to just buy one off the shelf. That's a mistake. To be functional, you need a few things put into them, and they can do that at the factory. So he said, I will do that. You'll pay for it. This is your thing. But I will bring it out, and then I will show you how to use it. So he did. So it was made for us. The one that we have is 500 liters. It was made for us in 2014. We brought it out. The first vintage we used it for was 2015. And he was with us only for a year because he became terminally ill, unfortunately, and died about a year after that.
For the people that don't know what an amphora is, can you...
explain what it is?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a big clay pot. So the history of wine is interesting. So wine's been made for 8,000 years. Yeah. And everybody thinks that if you're making a premium red wine, it's got to be done in barrels. But barrels have only been around for, maybe 1,500 years. It's still a long time, but not as long as the life of wine. So what did people do? People made wine, beer, olive oil. What they do? What they store it in? Well, they stored it in clay. That's what people used. And so an amphora is the Greek spelling. The spelling I use, the Greek one. Amphora is also Italian, but they spell it differently. And it is basically a big clay pot, and which you can use for fermentation and you can use for aging. Now, they're still very common in Eastern Europe, but they tend to bury them in the ground for temperature control. And anybody who's visited Turkey or places like that, Northern Italy, some wineries will see them in the ground. I don't, because the clay is porous, and I want the air, the bit of air uptake that you can get through clay. But it's a 500-liter big clay pot. That's what it is. And I love it because it enables me to do things with the wine that I cannot do either in stainless steel tanks like we have behind me or my barrels, because I can keep the skins in it for as long as I want. So I keep the skins in it for about 8 or 10 months, something like that.
Is there anything that the clay, qualities that the clay gives the...
I don't know. Maybe I don't really know. Okay. Maybe an earthy character. Yeah. I don't know. Our wines are more savory and earthy anyway. They're not really fruity. I mean, when you pick up a wine with primary fruit characters, people talk about, it's raspberries or blackberries or something like that. You can't do that with our wines. They just don't have those characters. Right. And so is some of that being imparted by the clay? I don't know. What it enables me to do is to keep the skins and do things that I cannot do otherwise.
And so why do you choose to hand harvest?
Well, we couldn't mechanize it. The trellis system that I use is something called a lyre system, and the only other people who do it in New Zealand is Kumia River, who makes, like one of the world's great Chardonnays off of it. And it all came about because of a guy called Richard Smart, and we used him as a consultant when we were planting the grapes. And Richard Smart again, sort of like Danny Schuster was this world-class viticulturalist, and he had been the scientist at the DSIR in MAF in the 1980s, and we got to know him as well.
Right.
The Archella system couldn't do it, but quite apart from that, we're not big enough. Yeah. You need to have, even if we could, this is an area which has a lot of, humidity, rainfall, and so not always are the grapes going to be in perfect condition, and so you have to sort through them. Yeah. We try to do that, before we harvest anyway, to make it easier for the pickers. But I mean, everything can change. I don't use botrycides, and botrytis is a big issue. I use when the grapes are turning color and getting ripe, I use bentonite, which is clay, and I just spray clay on it.
Interesting.
And so I don't use any chemicals out there, or haven't. I always may.
And it is like I live obviously behind and in front of and everything at lots of vineyards, and the amount of spraying on a lot of them is crazy. I kind of wonder if consumers knew what they were looking at.
Look, we have to spray every 10 to 14 days for sure. But we attempt to be. I'm not organic, but because we live in the middle of the property, I'm very aware of any toxicity. Yeah. So I don't use any insecticides. Yeah. That is, pesticides. Mm-hmm. I don't use any of those. Yeah. But we do have problems with insects, and so I have to do alternative methods to try to deal with them.
So for aspiring winemakers and wine enthusiasts looking to enhance their understanding, are there any winemaking theories or principles you recommend that they explore or dive into?
Oh, well, I've just explained how we do it, which is generally probably quite different. Yeah. It goes to this question you asked about, what advice would I give me if I was 25? Don't do it. Don't do anything just because your neighbor does it. Find out why your neighbor does it, and if it has good reasons, then do it. Yeah. But always trial things. Always experiment with making and growing, because that's the fun part of anything, any type of horticultural activity. Growing anything is it may be that you're growing, like you ask about vegetable gardens, it may be that you're in an area which gets lots of powdery mildew, and so you say, well, how do I deal with that? How do I grow it? How do I control all of that? Well, you just look around and try certain things, and they may work and they may not. So look, when we first started, as I said, I didn't know. The advantage that I had is that I did not have an intergenerational view. I wasn't the third generation, and I do what my father does, and I do what my grandfather does. I didn't know, so I had very much of an open mind, and that's why I would go to various people, and I would go to the Corbins, whoever, who would say, you do it like this, you do it like this, you do it like that, and I would try it, and then I modify it. Even with Stefano, who was the Italian winemaker, I've modified significantly how we use the amphora.
I like that you keep learning and you're willing to change things. I think that's a talent.
Well, I don't know if it's a talent. I'm sure everybody does it. It is what we do, and it keeps your interest up, doesn't it? Yeah. Because I'm always reading. I'm always finding out what other people do, I think it's a fun thing, but everything's not going to be a winner. Yeah.
I was told to ask you about the story about the Abel clone.
Oh, the Abel clone? Yeah. Who asked you that?
Yeah.
What, she doesn't really know anything. Well, the Abel clone. So Abel clone is a significant clone in New Zealand for Pinots. Yeah. All right. So we'd go out. Let's go back to the 70s and the 80s. We'd go out and visit these wineries. Always Croatian background, And even though we became interested in this, we never really thought that this would be something that we could do until we visited a winery behind QMU, which was called Abel's. And we got to know the guy, and the guy's name was Malcolm Abel. And he grew Pinot Noir, and he grew something else I can't remember. And he was making his wine in his garage. But the point about Malcolm Abel was that he was not He didn't have a generational experience of winemaking. He was a customs officer at the airport, and he worked during the day, and then he came back, and he was the first person that we met who demonstrated to us that you didn't have to have that family history, that you could do it by not having any background and by even doing something else in the meantime, as you're developing all of that. So he, in particular, was the catalyst. The Pinot that he brought in from Burgundy, he brought in, just through customs, and he was a customs officer, and I think he probably did it in a suitcase. I don't know. But now people know the able clone of Pinot Noir, but not necessarily relating it to that guy. I could tell you one other story.
Yeah.
I tell you one other story about how these things work. So back in 1988, so Mary and I went, there was a cool climate symposium in Auckland, happened every 4 years somewhere around the world. And it was being organized by a guy called Richard Smart. And Richard Smart, we could then see, it was a 5-day conference, viticulture, winemaking, all of these things. But it was, well over our head. But we could see that the guy, Richard Smart, is who we needed to deal with. And so we got in touch with him afterwards. But at that time, there are lots of different ways of growing grapes, different systems, different techniques of growing grapes. Obviously, we use one. But there was one at that time which was being touted as being really good, which was something called the Scott-Henry system. The Scott-Henry system is when you have a VSP system, maybe your canopy is too dense, all your vines are growing up, but you grow some up and you grow some down.
Yeah.
And without going into the detail, it was developed in Oregon by a guy called Scott Henry at Henry Estate Winery.
Right.
And I have a sister who lived and was friends with this guy, Scott Henry. He lived in Oregon. And some months after this symposium, my sister got in touch with me and she said, I was speaking to Scott Henry, and he described this most unusual experience that he had. He had come down to New Zealand to this cool climate symposium where the buzzword and the buzz technique was this Scott Henry system. And he said, we all had name tags. We're all sitting, in workshops talking about new ways of growing grapes that get, what do you do with various issues. And everybody's talking about the Scott Henry system. But nobody related it to him. And so he said it was a very unusual experience of being in a room in which an idea which you had developed had taken on a public, in the public domain where nobody thought that maybe it had an origin somewhere.
This is a personal question, but you don't have to answer it. So how I've asked about living a bountiful life. One of my questions is about challenge. And so can you tell me about a time in your life that hasn't been so bountiful and how you overcame it?
Well, most recently it's probably the death of my wife, which happened very unexpectedly over 3 weeks. Yeah. And we were married for 45 years, a long time. We were together for 45 years. And she, when we had the celebration of her life, and we did it a few months after she actually passed away, so that we could get through as much as possible the emotional experience of this loss. But we wanted it to be a positive, so we had a party. And lots of people, and I told the story of our different personality types. We had quite a volatile relationship, but she, her go-to response on anything was yes, and mine was no. But we always worked it out. And that's a big loss for me. So I have to be aware of all of that. Yeah. But Herons Flight was largely due to not me. Sure, I can make the wine, but the personality and the humanity, which hopefully we display, was her. Yeah. And so that loss is quite significant.
I hope she lives on in the vineyard and the work that you're doing every day.
Yeah, it's one of the things that she said when she was dying. It was that she took my hand and she said, and this was just before she became sort of non-compos mentis.
Yeah.
She said, look after yourself and look after the grapevines, because that's our legacy. Yeah. So we look at the vineyard as that. It's not a hobby. Mm. It's we'd like to continue it as long as possible. They mean something, because my wife's, Mary's, attitude towards wine, as I mentioned to you before, is that wine was never an end in itself. It was always a means to an end. And the end that it was a means to was conviviality. You drink it with family, you drink it with friends, and it's a life-enhancing experience. And the whole history, I mean, I read a lot about the whole history, the scientific history, the cultural history of wine. And that's what it is, and that's what it does. It enhances civilization. And so whenever I look and I'm dealing with the vines, I just think of her. Yeah. And I think of that attitude towards what it is that we're doing. It's not a business. I mean, yes, of course it's a business, but, we're not, it's you don't make a lot of money doing it.
You asked me why I wanted to start Bountifull and why I do this. And I am a great cook and have that intuitive, just bring things together, which is incredibly lucky. It might be my Italian heritage, but I just have always believed in, I'm not a gift giver, but the gift that I do have to give is food and time. And so I think that's why I wanted to start it, because of that gift, and then conversation flows off the back of that.
Look, I mean, food is when we built this big restaurant on the property, and we had a variety of chefs, and we had, at one point, we had this a young South Korean chef. And she was fantastic, and she could control the kitchen. He was tiny. I asked her at one point, I said, our restaurant is sort of an Italian theme. It's not an Italian restaurant, but it's Italian theme because of, the grapes and our attitude and the slow food and all of these things. And she said, you don't understand, South Korean, we're very similar to Italians. And I said, how so? How so? She said, because if you travel around Italy and you visit a family, you go in, you're visiting somebody, what happens? You sit, you eat. Yeah. Nothing happens. You have to eat first, then you do things. She said that's what happens in her culture as well. You come in, she said, if you visited my family, you'd sit, we'd feed you. Okay, the food's different. Yeah. But it's the attitude and the relationship with food and what food does in terms of a welcoming thing. Yeah. So, yeah, you're quite right. I mean, if you are an inspired cook, you're very lucky.
So we're going to do a quick fire round now.
Okay.
Questions. So say the first thing that comes to mind. What, in your opinion, is the most underrated fruit or vegetable?
Well, I love eggplants.
And how do you like to have it?
I will stuff them.
Yep. Mm. Do you have a veggie garden?
I do.
What do you like to grow?
Tomatoes and lettuces.
Yep.
And spring onions and capsicums.
And the world's biggest cauliflower?
Well, that's Heather's doing. We have, over the years, we have had so many attempts at vegetable gardens. Yeah. We've had lots of raised gardens, and we've grown, almost everything. The problem with this area in Matakana is that everything is very vigorous, and we have something called kikuyu grass, and weeds are just bountiful. So you talk about living your bountiful life. Weeds are one of the issues that you have. And so if you're not on top of it all the time, and because a vineyard takes 120% of your time, if you couldn't look after your vegetable garden, then it would just get overgrown. Yeah. And always disappointing. My wife loved to make an attempt to grow vegetables. But, so now what I do is I do them in barrels, and I do them so that whenever I walk outside, I trip over them. Yeah. So that means that I look after them.
It's good. I love that. Bountiful is not always the bounty that you want.
No, but they do say, one man's weeds is another man's vegetables, but I haven't quite gotten that far yet.
I need to introduce you to my foraging guy.
Yeah, foraging, yeah, that's right.
And do you love to cook?
I do. My wife was a inspirational cook. She was able to just look in I mean, she had the one, intuitive skill levels in terms of cooking. She could go into the fridge, go into wherever someone was coming over, whatever, and she could make 5-star meals. In fact, when Heather first met her, and she was, quite blown away by the quality of the food which was coming out of this little kitchen, and you didn't see it until it's only just been redone.
Yeah,
I cook, but I use recipes, so I like recipes. My wife also, had you visited us about 6 months ago, you would have seen that the kitchen was primarily recipe books, and her aim was to write a history of New Zealand food through the history of cooking books. So we had cooking books going back to the 1930s. Wow. And we had a huge range of cooking books, which is just, looking at them and looking at the different types of recipes.
Yeah.
But look, I'm of the age where I remember when Kim Hill used to, not Kim Hill, Sharon Crosby on Radio New Zealand, this was well before your time, used to interview Alison Holtz and had a weekly spot and talking about recipes and foods and things like that.
Yeah.
And she was great. So I like to cook. I'm not an inspired cook. I use recipes, but I like to be adventurous and cook things I'm not familiar with.
What's your favorite wine?
Oh, my favorite wine? Old school Zinfandel.
Oh, good choice.
So, yeah.
Worst meal that your parents made you eat?
Worst meal was probably spaghetti.
Not out of a
cooked
can.
by, well, almost. Cooked by my mother, who was not an inspired cook.
Right. Most spontaneous thing you've ever done?
Come to New Zealand.
Yeah, I was going to say that, becoming a resident when you were meant to just be passing through and going to Kenya.
Coming to New Zealand, yeah.
Biggest challenge you've had to overcome?
I think everything has been a challenge. The biggest one, I don't know, trying to do this without a lot of capital behind you.
I understand that.
I think.
What word describes your life?
I don't know. I mean, I would like to think that I, as much as possible, live an authentic life, and as much as possible for me. But that's highly pretentious to say that. So I don't know. I mean, look, I have so many regrets. And when I just said, try to avoid having regrets, yeah, but we all do.
But we can go with authentic. I like that, and what I've seen of this place, and you live in it. What are you most proud of?
My family.
I'd agree with that. They're an awesome bunch.
I'm very lucky that they want to come back and live here.
Yeah. And then the final question is, and it's broad, sorry, but what is the dream for you?
I'd like to carry the vineyard on without necessarily me being involved day to day. Yeah. That's what I would like to do. Yeah. Yeah. And that my family will continue to stay here.
David, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the Bountifull Podcast. Your dedication to winemaking, your innovative and fresh thinking approach, and the unique story of Herons Flight Vineyard is truly inspiring. Thank you for sharing your expertise and insights with.
Well, I think thank you very much. So now, thank you very much for having me. Good luck with this.
Thanks.
I think you'll do it well.
I hope so. For the audience eager to explore more of David's work, I'll put all of the links in the show notes. If you found today's episode inspiring, don't forget to subscribe or follow along. We've got an amazing season in the works planned, and those episodes should be dropping soon. World-class talent, people, and delightful conversations. Thanks so much, and thank you.
And thank you.